Folks, it really is indeed my pleasure to introduce the speaker for this evening. Turns out, following that, after a hiatus of a few years, he came back to Point as a graduate student of mine. Travis has been doing research on black-footed ferrets for about 15 years at this point, and he has dozens of publications relative to black-footed ferret biology and ecology. He also counts among his friends people like the photographer Tom Mangelson, the author David Quammen, and that naturalist and conservationist Jane Goodall. So he's got quite an impressive array of people that he rubs shoulders with on a regular basis. He's also won a number of prestigious awards, including most recently the documentary Oscar award for a film that he starred in relative to black-footed ferret ecology. So he's really done quite well there. But perhaps his greatest claim to fame is the fact that Wait, Don't Tell Me featured him on a segment of theirs a few years back. Actually, he had been quoted without attribution in a novel written by a woman about a bare-chested, loincloth-wearing Native American who, after engaging in pleasures with a woman, a settler woman, begins to wax eloquent about the biology of black-footed ferrets. So, I kid you not, this was written in a novel, and this woman got caught plagiarizing Travis's comments that were picked up in a magazine. It just took it word for word right out of there. So, although he may not look like a loincloth, bare-chested hunk of a man, he certainly is. And there is one more very big claim to fame that Travis has before I turn it over to him, and that is the fact that he holds single-handedly the longest record it took to get a master's degree out of UWC. But he has succeeded in that, and without further ado, let me turn it over to Travis Livieri. Travis.
It took me 10.5 years to complete my master's degree.
Persistence.
So, yes.
That hard to work.
They called a few times and said, this is your last chance, this is your last chance, and then finally, and even after 10.5 years, on the very last day, at 4:29 p.m., I was running with a stack of papers to the library on campus to get my thesis turned in on time, because that was the deadline, bar none. So even at that point, I was almost late. Thank you for the, maybe thank you for the introduction. I've been very fortunate to work with a very charismatic creature, and that's what really takes me to all these great places and gets me to all these neat people that I've gotten to meet over the years. 20 years ago, never would I have imagined that I would be standing back here at Stevens Point talking about something and giving, in essence, a lecture to Dr. Anderson, Dr. Freckman, Dr. Hall. Classrooms I was sitting in 20 years ago, probably falling asleep, and Freckman teaching me how did you not know this was a stinging nettle when you picked it on the ground with your bare hand? I don't know. Yet I find myself here today, and I'm very happy to be here. So let's get started on black-footed ferrets. You're going to hear me use the word we a lot tonight. Now when I say we, don't think of myself or the organization I work for. The Black-Footed Ferret Recovery Program is a huge, immense program. This is just a sampling of the agencies, organizations, tribes, zoos, universities, nonprofits that are all involved in black-footed ferret recovery. So this is a huge program. So when I say we, this is a very big collective we that is really the Black-Footed Ferret Recovery Program. So what is a black-footed ferret? So, of course, I had to take mammalogy with Dr. Long here at Stevens Point and Mustela nigripes. Let's break that down for those of you who had Sunday school and Latin and that kind of thing. Mustela, what is the scientific name for a house mouse? Oh, no mammalogists, all burgers out here. M-U-S. It is mus musculus, so mus, M-U-S. So mouse, then we have tella, and tella was a tellum, which was a spear in Latin times. So we have a mouse-shaped spear, NIGR meaning black, and PES, a ped, a podiatrist. So we have a black-footed mouse-shaped spear. They are one of 3 living ferret species on this planet, but is the only one native to North America. And one of the unique things about this is they are an obligate carnivore. They only eat really one thing out there. So just to give you an idea of where the different ferret species occur on this planet, so we've got black-footed ferrets that basically cover the Great Plains of North America, the European ferrets, which is where the domestic ferrets come from, over in Europe and Western Asia, and then over in Asia, the actual Siberian polecats. So what's the difference between these species? So we have a black-footed ferret up here, a European, Siberian, and a domestic. They're physically very similar. Really, outwardly, the only real difference is the coloration. Black-footed ferrets always look just like that: black tail tip, black feet, black mask. Whereas other species tend to have a little bit more different coat coloration sometimes, and also their hair is a little bit shorter. They are able to hybridize, so again, you might argue that they're not necessarily different species completely, but they are separated geographically. So the difference in the species is mainly habitat and perspective over time. And that time being, at one point, black-footed ferrets were probably Siberian polecats, and when Asia was connected to North America via the Bering Land Bridge, ferrets came down across the land bridge into Canada, down into the Great Plains, and they found this super abundant food source, prairie dogs. And then they began to evolve and specialize into that specialized predator of prairie dogs. So historically, not much has been known about black-footed ferrets. The Native Americans knew about them long before Europeans did, and they had their own myths and traditions. They used them for medicine pouches and ceremonial headdresses and those kinds of things. They were first described as science in 1851 when John James Audubon and John Bachman actually wrote up the first account in the quadrupeds of North America. After that instance, that was the first documentation of this mammal, which is pretty late in terms of a mammal being documented in North America, at least a medium-sized mammal. But not very much was known about black-footed ferrets throughout most of the 1800s and early 1900s. The very first population ever studied was in 1964. It really was not that terribly long ago that the first actual population was studied, and they learned about the real basic ecology of black-footed ferrets. They learned that they were mostly nocturnal, and they are associated with prairie dogs. They were listed under the First Endangered Species Act, and this population in South Dakota, which lasted for about 10 years, they kind of knew it was blinking out. It was a little bit of a race against time because this was the only real population they knew about out there. They did capture 6 of them up and brought them into captivity, into Patuxent Wildlife Refuge over in Maryland. They did try to breed those guys, but they actually did not produce any viable offspring. And they essentially, just like the passenger pigeon, watched this species die in captivity. So by 1980, they actually thought black-footed ferrets were extinct. Not a single live specimen was known to occur anywhere on this planet. So there were guys who were out there chasing ghosts, trying to find, the last ferrets that were out there. Well, 30 years ago, September 26th of 1981, so 30 years ago this fall, on a dark, moonless night near the town of Meeteetse, Wyoming, a ranch dog named Shep had an encounter with a little creature that came to his food bowl one night. Being the good ranch dog that Shep was, he dispatched the intruder, and in the morning he brought it home to his master, John and Lucille Hogg. Little Hogs got up in the morning and came out, "Oh, what you got there, Shep?" And they picked it up and looked at it, and, that's a pretty neat looking creature. Threw it on the garbage pile and sat there for half a day. Until the wife, Lucille, said, "We're going to town, so why don't you just pick that off the garbage pile? We'll take that cute little creature into town and get it stuffed." That's how we rediscovered black-footed ferrets. So think about the tenuous circumstances of this species and how it was rediscovered. It could have easily existed there without Shep ever bringing one home and blinked out into oblivion. We never would have had the chance ever again. So biologists rushed into Meeteetse to this population, another chance to save this species. And the population peaked at 129 ferrets. Then also the next year was 58. Uh-oh, something's going on. So they determined that two diseases, sylvatic plague and Canada distemper, were decimating this population. So a mad scramble happened about 1985, and they brought the last 18 into captivity. So there we were, 18 black-footed ferrets, all from one population, highly related. And that was it. That was the last of the species left on this earth. So let's take the first couple rows right here. That's 18 people. Let's wipe out everybody on earth except for these 18 people. That's how close we came to extinction again with black-footed ferrets. Now remember that the first captive breeding effort with those 6 they brought from South Dakota failed. So there was no known quantities here that they were going to be able to do anything. This time captive breeding was successful. They learned enough in the first go-around that we were able to produce kits. That's what young black-footed ferrets are called, in captivity. And they were spread out to other zoos and facilities across North America. And now they produced enough in captivity, we could put them back out into the wild. So by 1991, we started putting black-footed ferrets back out into the wild for reintroduction. So reintroduction, the term they taught me in college was adaptive management. I call it fly by the seat of your pants. There's no textbook on how to do this, so we really had to make it up as we went along. So a lot of experimentation went into how we put ferrets back out into the wild. And we've learned quite a bit about ferret biology, prairie dog ecology and biology, which is their primary prey, and we're always learning more. So research is a very integral part of what we do in the Black-footed Ferret Recovery Program. So it began in 1991 and continues today, and we are looking for large blocks of prairie dog habitats, so large prairie dog colonies. That's our general criteria for where we start looking for sites to put black-footed ferrets out. So to give you an idea of the geographic scope right now of black-footed ferrets, so the number one right here, that is where the historic South Dakota population was in the 60s and 70s, that blinked out. There's Meeteetse, Wyoming, where the last 18 came from. And then all these little dots you see here, those are all the reintroduction sites across the west now. So we have the shaded range of the black-tailed prairie dogs, blacktail, whitetail, and Gunnisons. And black-footed ferrets occurred exactly in that range too. We've also got the Phoenix Zoo, Cheyenne Mountain Zoo, a federal breeding center, Louisville, Washington, D.C., Toronto Zoo. Those are the ones that breed black-footed ferrets and send them out to guys like me to put them out for reintroduction. So that kind of gives you a bit of the scope, the geographic scope of black-footed ferret recovery right now as it stands. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the site that I work mostly on in South Dakota. It's called Kanata Basin. How many of you folks have been to Wall Drug? Oh yeah. Somebody saw a sign on I-90 on the way out there maybe. So here's I-90, there's the great town of Wall, and Rapid City, the Black Hills, Mount Rushmore, and all those good things, Wind Cave down there. So we're just about 60 miles east of the Black Hills, just around Badlands National Park. That's also part of the reintroduction site, and U.S. Forest Service land called the Buffalo Gap National Grassland. So the familiar spot down there is called Kanata Basin, and that's an area where there's quite a few prairie dogs, and we've had a really good management scheme there for a while to create prairie dog habitat. So this is mixed grass prairie. This is only black-tailed prairie dogs in this area, and again, it's U.S. Forest Service administered. So as you know, with Chequamegon and Nicolet National Forest, when it's U.S. Forest Service, that means multiple use. So it's managed for grazing, fishing, hunting, rock hounding, ATV off-road, anything that you can think of. So in contrast to across the fence is Badlands National Park, which is very much a preservationist attitude of no collecting anything at all. But they both have prairie dogs in these areas, and they make an excellent reintroduction site combined. What really created this reintroduction site was land exchange. what we've got here in 1964, here's Badlands National Park in the pinkish. Private lands are in the light blue, and national grasslands, Forest Service lands in the green. These are square miles, so that kind of gives you an idea of the perspective out there. You can see, this is Kanata Basin right here. There's quite a bit of intermingled private land. There's no way you could really grow prairie dog counties effectively without them encroaching on the private land, which, as some of you may know, is not always a desirable thing by landowners. So in 1964, it probably was not possible to really maintain a large black-footed ferret population. But through land exchange, and I want you to watch kind of this area right in here, 20 years later, it's looking a little bit better. And then by 2004, with some aggressive land trades, they blocked up all of this land into federal land. So the private landowners got a benefit of blocking up their own land, which actually was more valuable for their land, for their property values. And the Forest Service, the federal lands, got more management control of the federal lands. So this really was a win-win situation through a very aggressive land exchange program. And this is really what the foundation of being able to build prairie dog colonies in Kanata Basin. So we released about 150 Blackfoot ferrets that came from zoos into Kanata Basin, and through about a 4-year period, and the population pretty much shot up to about almost 300 individuals by 2007. This, at that point, was the largest Blackfoot ferret population ever documented. So this is another map to kind of give you the idea of the distribution of Blackfoot ferrets. This was in 2005. So we've got in the blue here, prairie dog colonies spread across Kanata Basin. Again, the green would be Forest Service and Badlands National Park. Every single circle and triangle you see on here is an individual Blackfoot ferret. So after we release Blackfoot ferrets, we have to go out and monitor them. We also call it chasing weasels. We tried a couple different methods that didn't always work. We pretended to be a Blackfoot ferret and crawled down into the burrow itself. That didn't work really well. We tried another strategy. We tried to teach the ferrets to use a GPS unit and cell phones for them to call us up and tell us where they were and how they were doing. That didn't work very well either. But why do we want to monitor Blackfoot ferrets? We want to know how this is going in terms of reintroduction. A lot of time and effort is being put into this program. So we need to determine the success of this reintroduction. And also learn about these Blackfoot ferret populations in the wild, because we don't know very much about this species. So our primary method is spotlighting. And when I first got this job in South Dakota working on Blackfoot ferrets, I called my friends up back home in Wisconsin here and said, "They're paying me to shine animals at night. There's no beer involved, but they're paying me to shine animals." It's very much a high-tech redneck science is what I call it, because we're bumping around in a prairie dog colony at night looking with a big light for the green eye shine of Blackfoot ferrets as they poke their head out of the burrow. A periscope is what we call it. Each ferret released has a microchip inside of them, the same kind of microchip you see in cats and dogs these days, and they use them in all kinds of wildlife actually. So we can put a ring reader right over the mouth of the burrow, and they pop their head through, and we can know exactly who they are. We've also used radio telemetry to a certain degree. Now, if any of you have ever handled a domestic ferret, you know that they're basically a little furry snake. So trying to fit a radio collar around the neck of an animal that has a head the same size as its neck is really nearly impossible. But with the right fit, you can get it to maintain for a while. The battery life on these is maybe a month to 2 months at most. Very limited range and sometimes some real difficulties. But we've got some really excellent data on movements, survival, and behavioral aspects when we first were putting ferrets out into the wild. So it was a very important part of the program very early on. When we get adequate snow out there, now believe it or not, in South Dakota, it does not snow that much. But when it does snow, it tends to snow sideways. But when you get some nice lilting snow that falls down the ground and builds up, you can go out and snow track ferrets. They leave a very distinctive track in the snow as they bound from prairie dog burrow to prairie dog burrow. And you can kind of see this zigzag pattern, almost like connect the dots on the prairie. They also do a little bit of digging. We call it trenching. Well, they'll actually kind of scallop out an area as they pull some dirt out of the burrow as they're getting down to a prairie dog. And then in the fall, when the young are dispersing from their mothers, the kits, we go out and live trap them. Why do we live trap them? Is because the wild-born animals don't have the little microchips in them. If they did, then my job would be a lot easier. So after they get caught, we bring them back to a little mobile trailer I have out there, a little mobile lab. We actually knock them out on site, and it's, picture this, you're a black-footed ferret, you wake up at the crack of 10 p.m., you crawl up out of your burrow, you stick your head out in your periscope, and there's a big light. Oh my gosh. Somebody comes, puts a trap in, you walk up in the trap, and a few hours later you wake up next to your burrow, and you've been abducted. So these guys, they get knocked up with isoflurane gas. They get a pit tag. There's a needle for the pit tag right there. Penicillin, can distemper vaccine, plague vaccine, DNA sample, blood sample, feces if we can get them. In the springtime, we'll even stick something up their nether regions and get sperm out of them. And put them right back to where they were caught. So think of every great Far Side cartoon you've ever read by Gary Larson, and this is right in that vein. And then they get to go back home. So life in the wild for a black-footed ferret is not always easy. The average lifespan is about 1.5 to 2 years. So these guys have a very short window to really get their job done. They breed within their first year of life, so at 10 months of age, they're ready to breed. They're fully ready to go. They're polygamous breeders, so a male will breed as many females as possible. And they have a 1 litter per year, with an average litter size of about 3. So they're not terribly prolific breeders in that way. But a little bit opposite of what you think of with an endangered species. You tend to think of things that are more longer lived, and the older age classes are the ones that are more fecund and more valuable. Whereas no, here, it's the young age class that really does most of the breeding, and it's really valuable to the population. They're mostly nocturnal, and they are active year-round. So there's no hibernation. That little motor is running 24/7, 365. And what do they eat? Big, fat, plunky prairie dogs. 90% of their diet is prairie dogs. We find them only on prairie dog colonies, only in prairie dog burrows. The other 10% of their diet are things they might find on the prairie dog colony, like a mouse or a rabbit or something like that. I mean, they've even been known to take some small birds occasionally, but it's very opportunistic. So prairie dogs is everything to black-footed ferrets. I don't get to see the actual predation event because it happens below ground, but we do know a little bit about it. And what usually happens, we think at least, is prairie dogs are sleeping at night because they're diurnal. They tend to sleep together in a ball down in their burrow system. The ferret will creep down there at night. He'll use his whiskers and his sense of smell and his long guard hairs and his toes to kind of feel his way around down there, pick out a prairie dog and snap, put a neck bite on and suffocate. And then he'll drag the prairie dog out to another burrow and chomp away at it. They'll kill about 1 prairie dog every 3 days on average. When a mom has young in June, July, August, she's probably killing 1 prairie dog per day just to maintain herself and then wean the young off onto the prairie dogs. Again, 1.5 to 2 years survival out in the wild. This is not an easy life for these guys. They are a middle-level carnivore predator, so they're eating prairie dogs, but they're also looking above them and seeing what's going to eat them. That would be coyotes, badgers, great horned owls, occasionally a bobcat and things like that. So there are predators of them that can do quite an efficient job sometimes, particularly great horned owls. Survival the 1 year, we're talking about 30% for the males and 50% for the females. So this is Kanata Basin. This is a prairie dog colony. This is a home of a black-footed ferret. A far cry from what it looks like in Wisconsin. When I first got out there, I could not believe I couldn't see a tree for miles and miles, but I've learned to love this habitat. It's just an incredible ecosystem. And prairie dogs really are the foundation for this prairie ecosystem. The species you see here are all dependent in some way on prairie dogs. Ferruginous hawks, bison, burrowing owls, badgers, swift fox, mountain plovers, those little weaselly things over there. But why are they in danger? I'm not much of a mathematician, but I'll have a little bit of math here for you. Prairie dogs equal black-footed ferrets. You cannot have this without having that. Again, this ecosystem, really the foundation, the keystone of this ecosystem are prairie dogs. Poisoning of prairie dogs, which is actually subsidized by the U.S. government, occurred throughout much of the 20th century. Trainloads of strychnine and other nasty poisons were sent out by the government to poison prairie dogs, usually in the name of cattle production. So as we started to send out trainloads of these nasty, nasty poisons to poison prairie dogs, you have all these dead prairie dogs above the ground. Oh, here come the eagles, dead prairie dogs. Uh-oh, there go the eagles. Oh, there go the wolves, there go everything else. So you had cascading effects of secondary poisoning throughout this ecosystem. So really nasty stuff that went on in terms of poisoning. Land conversion. If any of you have driven across Kansas, first of all, my condolences. But Kansas, when you look at it, was the heart of the prairie as you go from the tall grass into the mixed and short grass. And you look now, and it mostly looks just like this. So we converted a lot of this native prairie, where prairie dogs and ferrets existed for many, many years, into farm ground. So a lot of what's left today with prairie dogs is actually the worst of the stuff that was out there. Prairie dog shooting has become a very popular activity, unfortunately, throughout the years, and that's a smaller effect on prairie dogs. But folks come out and spend sometimes a week at a time with big, thick-barreled rifles shooting hundreds of rounds per day at prairie dogs. And all of this kind of comes together today into a big blurring of politics, sociology, and economics that has prairie dogs, the western rancher, cattle production, politics, money, ferrets, all kind of wound up together. And to give you an idea of how bad it can get politically, in 2004, the election in South Dakota the Senate election in South Dakota was for Tom Daschle. Remember him? He was the minority leader in the Senate, running against the young Republican John Thune, who was coming up. And here's a headline from the Washington Post. And here's the byline: who hates prairie dogs the most? You got senators, U.S. senators, tripping over themselves in Washington to prove who hates prairie dogs more, just for the sake that they think they're going to garner some votes. That's how politically twisted prairie dogs in this ecosystem can be sometimes. In Kansas, we got this fellow here, Larry Haverfield. I first met him in 2006 when he called the ferret program up and said, "Hey, I got a bunch of prairie dogs." And I thought, "Oh, I've heard this one before. Can you come poison them or come kill them all or come bring them ferrets to get rid of them?" He says, No, I like my prairie dogs. I got swift fox and burrowing owls and tons of ferruginous hawks out here. He said, "You're a cattle rancher?" He says, "Yeah." He says, "I graze them like bison." Oh, okay. This guy's got a little bit of a different mindset. Well, he wanted black-footed ferrets. But there's a state law in Kansas from 1901 that gives the county permission to come onto your private land, poison your prairie dogs, and give you the bill. Talk about private property rights being twisted in the reverse, especially in the western U.S. where states' rights and private property rights are such a big thing out there. And the county even came after a federal ruling that Larry could keep his prairie dogs and his ferrets. The county even came and illegally poisoned on his land. Of course, using the nastiest poisons they could find that had secondary effects. So this just gives you a little bit of an idea that this finding habitat for black-footed ferrets is really linked to prairie dogs, and it's not easy. But the biggest enemy biologically is plague. Now when I say plague, it is that. It is bubonic plague, sylvatic plague. You'll hear it called a couple different forms, but it's all the same disease. It's caused by the bacterium Yersinia pestis. And it is fatal to both prairie dogs and black-footed ferrets. Bubonic is when it gets into usually a human, and it'll travel to a lymph node and that lymph node will swell up and become black and becomes a bubo. So that's where the word bubonic plague comes from. And also you'll hear it called pneumonic plague, which is exactly pneumonia in your lungs. Septicemic plague, when it gets in your blood. There was a mountain lion researcher in Grand Canyon a few years ago who found one of his lions dead, that had a radio collar on it. Found one of his lions dead, and he went and he got it, and he was carrying it back home on his back. It was bleeding all over him, and I think he did a little bit of necropsy to see what had killed it. Well, he must have nicked himself, and he got a little bit of that mountain lion blood inside of him. Within 2 days, he was dead. So septicemic plague, that was the route for that. It's very deadly. And when we have it in wild mammals, we tend to call it sylvatic plague. This disease is not native to North America. It came over on ships with rats from Asia into the port in California, San Francisco, I believe, in 1901, and then spread across North America because our species here have not evolved any resistance to this disease. They have no resistance whatsoever. It's foreign. So just like purple loosestrife and other invasives, this is an invasive disease. So fleas are the primary vector of plague. Now plague still occurs throughout the world. I mean, we tend to think of plague as kind of the Middle Ages kind of thing, and oh, it's gone now, but actually it does still occur throughout the world, and even in some places in Africa, it's still a problem with humans. But in North America, it's actually been documented nearly coast to coast, but mostly you'll find it in the western U.S. Human cases are rare these days. You find them mostly down in the southwestern U.S., but it's very treatable with antibiotics, and so fatality is pretty rare. So we're back to South Dakota. We're back to Kanata Basin. For quite a few years, we did not have plague in South Dakota. We almost thought that we were somehow maybe immune to it. Then in May of 2008, we had the prairie dog colonies in blue here. These are all the ferret locations. We have a splotch of plague that came in May of 2008. I want you to watch this splotch. That right there is almost 3,000 acres as it is. So we're still in May of 2008. Another week later in May. We're into June of 2008. Still in June. July. September. October. November. And then for the winter it subsides a bit. We pick up again in June of 2009 and it starts taking out that area there. So to give you an idea, I mean, that disease wiped out 10,000 acres within a little over a year. So nearly a third of the habitat we had existing at that time wiped out by a disease within a year. So this is by far the biggest biological threat to black-footed ferrets. So there, we lost all of that habitat. That's kind of where we stand today. So again, it's a little bit more math for you. A pile of dead prairie dogs does not equal black-footed ferrets. So if you've got plague, you have no prairie dogs, you have no black-footed ferrets. So again, we've lost a bit more since that map I showed you. We've lost now 20,000 acres of prairie dog colonies in Kanata Basin, approximately 2/3, and about 2/3 of the black-footed ferrets in this book, what once was the largest black-footed ferret population out there. So what's being done? The federal agencies, so out there, the Park Service, the Forest Service, and the Fish and Wildlife Service have banded together and they're dusting prairie dog burrows. If you recall what I said, fleas are the primary vector of plague. So we have this very effective dust called deltamethrin. You spray it right down in the prairie dog burrows and it kills fleas. So it kind of halts the transmission of plague. So every year they dust, in the orange here, about 13,000 acres of prairie dogs out there. So that's, about 12,000. So roughly 500,000 burrows per year. Picture sitting on an ATV and having to drive up to each and every prairie dog burrow, stick a wand down it and spritz some dust. A Herculean effort, but this has been very effective in preventing plague and moving into further colonies. On another front, we have a vaccine that comes from the U.S. Army. U.S. Army. So plague is one of the top 10 bioterrorism threats for the U.S. So the U.S. Army developed a plague vaccine for humans. And you can't just go to Walgreens and walk up to the farmer and says, "Oh, can I have a couple doses of plague vaccine?" They'll look at you kind of funny. So we get it from the U.S. Army, and it's very effective on black-footed ferrets. So we spend quite a bit of time out in the field also protecting ferrets directly from plague through vaccination. And consequently, that vaccine comes from Madison, from the National Wildlife Health Center. They are working actually in Madison, and I got some flyers about some of their work up on the table back there, on an oral vaccine for prairie dogs. Now, one of the real challenges with vaccinating prairie dogs is you think about these huge expanses, these thousands of acres of prairie dogs. Well, you're not going to capture each one up and give them a shot. So we have to use a bait. Well, how do you distribute this bait? Things like that. You have to go through FDA approval and things like that. So they're working on some of these particulars of how we can use this prairie dog vaccine out in the field. So these are some of the tools that we now have for combating plague out in the field. So the future of Canada Basin, where I do a lot of my work, we must continue this dusting effort. We must continue vaccination until this prairie dog vaccine becomes available. That's going to really be the next great tool in our toolbox for combating this disease. So overall, range-wide, where are we with black-footed ferrets? So from those 18 individuals, we've produced more than 7,000 in captivity. So captive breeding is almost down to a science now, where they've done a tremendous job with that in the zoos. And about 3,000 of them have been put out into the wild in 19 different sites across North America. We have about 1,000 out in the wild, which would be about 400 adults, and 3 of the 19 sites are what we would call self-sustaining or viable. The goal of black-footed ferret recovery right now are 10 populations spread across that entire range from Canada down to Mexico, from Kansas over to Utah. There's 12 U.S. states. We want 10 populations, at least, self-sustaining. 1,500 black-footed ferrets will get us down to threatened. 3,000 will get us off the list completely. And a minimum of 30 adults per population. So this is the 2010 numbers. We're still calculating 2011. Kind of gives you an idea of the ferret numbers range-wide. So here's South Dakota. We've done pretty well with the 5 sites there. Wyoming's also done pretty well, and so has Arizona. Kansas is actually looking up better. But some of these sites that have plague, such as Colorado and Utah and New Mexico, have not done as well. So again, plague is our #1 enemy. But you look at some of these states, North Dakota, Nebraska, Oklahoma, Texas, we have not put ferrets in these states yet. We've had difficulty finding prairie dog colonies to put them into. So right now, recovery-wise, we've got categories of where we are. We've got successful sites, again, Arizona, South Dakota, Wyoming, some that are doing okay, and some that are kind of just middling along. So what is the future of black-footed ferrets? It's habitat. We need more habitat. But along with habitat is we need more social acceptance. Prairie dogs are one of the most reviled creatures out there, especially when you go out west. And how many of you have heard the myth that cattle break their legs in prairie dog holes? Everyone's heard that one. How many of you believe that cattle break their legs in prairie dog holes? I have yet to find a single rancher that actually can document that. It really is one of the biggest myths that exist out there. So we need more social acceptance and public outreach. So I referred to the Far Side. This is one of my favorite Far Side cartoons. The prairie dog developers, as they stand there with their map for the burrows, looking out, where are we going to plant our colony here? This is how we have to think about black-footed ferret recovery. But not only for black-footed ferrets, we're talking about burrowing owls, swiftfox, mountain plovers, and a whole host of other critters that need prairie dogs. So we need to think habitat. We all know that polar bears need ice for the seals. We know that koalas need eucalyptus, pandas need bamboo, ferrets need prairie dogs. So looking across the range of prairie dogs that are out there, let's break it up by state and see what do we need by state to put them back out in the landscape. So if you took the collective acreage of all of these species of prairie dogs and you broke it up by state, what percentage of that whole total is in North Dakota, It's 2.5%. So that's kind of their load, their share of black-footed ferret recovery. So let's calculate this out. Let's say, this is probably a low calculation, let's say about 200 acres or 230 acres per black-footed ferret out there. And we need to have sorry about that. We need to have 1,500 to go down to threatened, 3,000 to get off the list completely, off the endangered species list. So North Dakota, what do we need? We need 38 adults, we need about 6,000 acres of prairie dogs. To get off the list, 12,000 acres of prairie dogs. We need, and this might be a little bit low of an estimate, about 500,000 acres of prairie dogs, of high quality habitat in the West. This is 12 US states we're talking about. How big is Portage County? How many square miles? 806 square miles. Calculate that out, 640 acres per square mile. 515,000 acres. So we're talking about Portage County, spread across 12 US states. That'd be a pretty good start in recovering black-footed ferrets. So think about big scales. Think about landscapes. Here in Wisconsin, we tend to think in 40s and that kind of thing, 40 acres. 40 acres, when you plot it out in the prairie, is a postage stamp. You look at it and you go, wow, that's it? Think big out on the prairie. So we need, what does it take to become a black-footed ferret recovery site? We need acreage. Again, we won't even talk about black-footed ferret recovery at a site until you're talking thousands of acres. We need some assurance of some kind of protection. So at least, we don't need national parks all the time, but at least some consistent ownership of the land, that they're not going to poison the prairie dogs on us or something like that. And we need to look for partnerships. So we have tools and opportunities available to us. We have, I talked about plague mitigation. We have these vaccines we're using, dusting we're using. We're actually looking into the Farm Bill right now to see if we can use NRCS and the Farm Bill for prairie dog incentive programs to actually pay landowners to maintain prairie dog habitat on their land. Same way we work with CRP and other things like that. We've worked with different permit processes with black-footed ferrets. Because they're endangered species, of course there comes the bureaucracy and red tape. But similar to what wolves were in Yellowstone, non-essential experimental and things like that, we're doing that with black-footed ferrets. And that's helping to ease some of the landowner concerns. So we have tools available. We just need to build the habitat. So how can you help? Because I get this question a lot. You've already done the first step here. You're here to get educated about black-footed ferrets in the prairie. And now it's your job to go out and talk to others about that. Wow, there's this cool little creature out in the prairie. Hey, let's drive to South Dakota someday and go check out the prairie. Let's go check out this habitat. Find out what's happening on your public lands. Again, Kanata Basin area I told you about in South Dakota. Public land. Your public land. Your tax dollars maintain that land. Find out what's going on out there and make sure it's being managed the way that you want it being managed. How many of you remember, members obviously of Audubon, but how about TNC or World Wildlife Fund, or are you members of any of those organizations? Excellent. Continue to be members of those organizations. When you send your check in every year, ask them, what are you doing for black-footed ferrets and prairie dogs? Because if you don't, it's going to wolves or polar bears or pandas or something else. Make sure your voice is being heard with the big organizations. They are a part of black-footed ferret recovery. Be patient. This has been 30 years since Shep killed that black-footed ferret. So in 30 years we've gone from 18 individuals to about 1,000 out in the wild. We're going to recover this species. It's going to happen. This is one of the success stories for endangered species recovery. But it takes time. It takes patience. It takes funding and support. So keep these in mind when we talk about endangered species. We have the means. In other words, we have the tools to recover black-footed ferrets. We can mitigate plague. We can build prairie dog colonies. We can do all these things biologically in the landscape. But do we have the will to do that? That's the big question right now. Are we willing to stand up and say, we're going to manage for prairie dogs on our public lands out west? That's what we need to do. Do we have that will? as Eric mentioned, I had the great fortune of showing Jane Goodall the Prairie in South Dakota and Black-footed ferrets, and she had this really inspiring quote, in the brilliant emerald of the ferret's nighttime eyes lies hope for the future of the great North American prairies. And just an inspiring woman, and it was just amazing to meet her and to kind of re-energize some of us folks in the ferret program, because if she can have hope, I think we can too. This is one of my favorite pictures. I took this in 2005 in South Dakota. It's one of those pictures that you don't truly know, did I take this picture at sunset or sunrise? So are we going to let the sun set on this species and let it go quietly into the night and go extinct? Or is this a sunrise? Is this the dawning of a new day that this species is going to make another comeback and we're going to actually recover this one? That really is up to you to decide. And I thank you very much for coming out tonight. Questions? Yes, sir.
I noticed that your map, there's a population over the border in Mexico. Is there an active research unit there that cooperates with your organization?
So he's asking about the population in Mexico that we reproduced down there. And it's actually kind of funny down there in Mexico. It's nowhere near what we have up here in terms of relation with the land and that kind of thing. They have a reserve down there. It means nothing what it does up here, the same kind of words. So the University of Mexico actually runs that project from Mexico City. It's right in that border zone. So we literally have not been there in about 3 or 4 years now because we've been afraid of getting shot. But they've been working with the landowners quite closely. They went through a drought for quite a while, but there is a little bit of TNC work going on down there and a few other organizations working together on a larger scale project down there. We're talking, hundreds of thousands of acres in this area in Chihuahua. But it's kind of a mishmash of organizations. Yeah. There's not any real strong federal presence like there is in the U.S. with the Fish and Wildlife Service. We don't have that organization or that agency that sets the tone for things down there, unfortunately. Yes, ma'am.
Do you collect prairie dogs in northern Colorado where there are too many homes down? There's no room for them, so they're destroying things. It's sad.
So she's, okay, maybe more? She's asking about prairie dogs in northern Colorado, especially when they're encroaching on human habitats and whatnot there in Boulder and areas like that. What actually happens there is they've worked out deals with the developers saying that we're going to capture up the prairie dogs and we're going to send them to either the Raptor Recovery Center or to the Black-footed ferret breeding centers.
Who do they talk to?
The U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service is the main agency. So if you know folks out there, get my information, I can hook you up with them so where they can get their prairie dogs. And if you're going to get rid of them, let's put them to good use. At least. Yeah. Yes, ma'am.
What is the size of the ferret? I couldn't quite tell. And what is the relative size to the prairie dog?
Excellent. She's asking about the size of the ferret because I didn't give quite a good description there. Talking about maybe 2 feet long from nose to tail tip, about yay big around. An average Blackfoot ferret weighs a female about 700 grams. So that's a pound and 3/4, maybe close to 2 pounds exactly. A male about 1,000 grams to just over 2 pounds. Black-tailed prairie dog can weigh 1,500 grams on the high end. So they're the same size. Sometimes even a little bit bigger than the ferret themselves. So the advantage is they get them while they're sleeping. Yes, sir.
Kind of related to the first question, you indicated that there was average lifespan of 2 years. What is the longevity? If they're in captivity, do they live 10, 15, 20, or are they a short-lived animal?
So he's asking about the longevity in captivity and other spots. In captivity, we've had them live up to 10 years in captivity. I'd say the average in captivity is about 5 or 6 years. Actually, their breeding success in captivity falls off after about 3 years. So we know that naturally they're not supposed to live that long. So 1.5 to 2 years in the wild probably is about right for that physiology of an animal. That sunrise picture, that was sunrise by the way, that I took, she ended up being the oldest Black-footed ferret I ever documented. She lived to be 5 years old. that was like living to be 100 years old as a human. So she made it quite long. But yeah, in captivity they can go 5 years easily. Yes, ma'am?
You say all these came from 18 individuals. What about the lack of genetic diversity? How much of an issue is that and a concern?
Excellent question. Genetic diversity with 18 individuals as the founders of the population. And of those 18, they were all from the same population, so they were, some of them mother, daughter, brother, sister. We have not seen any large detrimental effects yet in captivity. We've seen some kinked tails, short ears, some bad teeth. One of the founders had one kidney, and genetically somehow that comes through occasionally and crops up. So it has not dropped off yet. When they breed them in captivity, they are very highly regulated. Who gets to breed who? Out in the wild, we can't control that, of course. But it's a very valid concern. Genetics are huge in this population. And out in the wild, we need to get populations established and get them growing so that we start getting genetic mutations in a good way out in the wild and coming out of that diversity again and increasing. So it's a kind of a little bit of a race against time in terms of genetics. Yes, sir?
Does the black-footed ferret have a range? I mean,
Yes.
this is their place to hunt, and how big is that?
As a matter of fact, that was my master's degree. Is what is the home range and territory of a black-footed ferret? We found about 200 acres is the average home range size for a black-footed ferret in South Dakota. And a territory within that, the defended portion, is probably about 75 acres. But when you look at that, you start calculating out how many prairie dogs are within 200 acres. There's a buttload of prairie dogs in that 200 acres. So it's probably more of a social thing, not necessarily related to how many prairie dogs are there, but they want to be solitary creatures. You know, they're like mink. They don't congregate in big numbers. They want to be solitary by themselves. They want their space. It's about 200 acres. So you start calculating that out, how much you need for just one ferret. 200 acres. Again, that's some big landscapes. You got to start thinking on bigger scales. You know, I grew up in Wisconsin. 200 acres to me was a forest. You know, out in the prairie, it's just a postage stamp. Another question? Yes, sir.
On your map of the land swap, I was curious about that patch of white land in the middle. Typically, you would expect that that's not where you want to swap because it comes up to the national park. And then you have larger wild area. Perhaps is that interior, is that the city, or why did they, in a sense, give away that centers the whole of the donut rather than someplace else?
Right. So he's asking about the land swap sequence I showed you, and right in the middle, there was 12 sections of private land that are just stark standing out there. It was one of those where I think those folks were not part of the land exchanges. They didn't own any of those intermingled portions, and they had nothing to exchange out. And for the most part, they've been somewhat cooperative, or at least tolerant of fair recovery. So there's been some efforts. Actually, Nature Conservancy did purchase one of those ranches just a few years ago. So there is some effort to try to block that up even more. And again, thinking about big landscapes in South Dakota.
It seemed like you gave some of the federal land to the private to make that white area bigger and bigger, and it seemed like you would be in the wrong place for vast landscape management.
It could have been. That was even before my time. So
That doesn't have to be inside the interior of
the town of Interior.
The residential.
Oh no, the town of Interior on that map would have been way off
Okay.
over on the eastern portion. So this is out in the ranching country. Yeah. So there's only 3 residences total in that 12 sections of land.
You showed mostly the national grassland. Is there equivalent good habitat and good management in the Badlands?
So he's asking
National
about
park area?
he's asking about national park there because it's right next to Canada Basin. Is there prairie dogs in there? There are some prairie dogs in there, but when they established a park in 1939 as a monument, actually at that point in time, it was to preserve the geological resources of the area. So if you ever go out there, you drive through the park, it's kind of this long, extended out boundary that follows the Badlands formations because of all the geology and cool fossils up there. So there's some intermingled prairie dogs in there, maybe a couple thousand acres. So there's some habitat, and it complements what's on there on the Forest Service lands. So it really is it's a combined project amongst several agencies. And they've been very, very cooperative. And they even fund some of my research work on it. Yes, sir.
Was there any subsequent litigation in Kansas after the county came in and eradicated the prairie dogs from those areas?
Yeah, he's asking about litigation in Kansas and if there's been more after the county came in to poison Larry Haverfield's land. It is still in litigation. It continues today. It has become the nastiest, most bitter fight I've ever seen over a little piece of ground in the middle of Logan County, Kansas. If you look, there's a nice little paper called the Hayes Daily News in Kansas, and a reporter by the name of Mike Corner who's covered this story. Just go on to hdnews.net someday and Google and search for Ferret, and his stories will come up, and he has them all documented in there. It is an incredible story of bitter feuds amongst a few folks out there over a little piece of land, over a rodent, over this cute little prairie dog and ferret. So it's very unfortunate. Yes, sir.
One more, you had a slide up there where you had maybe 4 or 5 other species indicating they were codependent and some with the ferret or prairie dog. Can you explain
Sure.
the
Let's see if I can
relationship of those
see
species?
if I can find that one real quick. So the species I had up there, prairie dogs are up top, and below them we had bison, swift fox, burrowing owls, black-footed ferrets. Got some plague ones here. Ferrets are the most obligate on prairie dogs. The other species don't rely quite as heavily on prairie dogs as black-footed ferrets do. But swift fox do better with prairie dogs. There we go. So we have a ferruginous hawk here. Ferruginous hawks love prairie dog colonies. If you ever get a chance to come out west and sit on a prairie dog colony in the early morning, you'll see ferruginous hawks sitting next to a prairie dog burrow on the ground before the prairie dogs even come up. And they're waiting, just waiting for that head to pop up, and they go snap, and they grab that. And that is one of the primary hunting methods for a ferruginous hawk, to pick up a prairie dog. So they do they're not dependent upon prairie dogs, but they do much better with prairie dogs. And if you look at trends of ferruginous hawk numbers throughout the years, they're on a decline over the years, and you can almost track it right with prairie dog numbers. Bison and prairie dogs kind of coexisted as probably 2 of the collective keystone species in the West. We had the great herds of bison. You know, again, think of 10,000 bison in one spot, coming into an area of grass, trampling it all down, eating it up, tearing it up, and then move on. Prairie dogs love disturbance, so they would move in behind the bison, and those are perfect places for them to expand their colonies into. And just like when you mowed your lawn, prairie dogs clip the grass constantly. So the plant is putting more nitrogen from the root out into the shoot to growing. So there's actually a higher nitrogen content in the plants on a prairie dog colony. Less biomass, but higher nitrogen content. So bison love prairie dog colonies. If you come out west, come out to Badlands Park in August, and you're going to see a couple hundred bison on a prairie dog colony, and they love it. And you're going to see them hanging out there for about 2 months at least. So again, not dependent, but very related in that way. Ferrets, hopefully you know by now what their dependence is. Burrowing owls use prairie dog burrows. Again, there's some good literature out there that shows that declines in prairie dog numbers are the same as the declines in burrowing owl numbers. A species that is very tied to prairie dogs. And then swift fox do better near prairie dogs. You'll still find them in Kansas and Colorado in areas without prairie dogs, but bigger populations, probably ones that are more self-sustaining, are associated with prairie dog numbers. Larry Haverfield in Kansas has got a buttload of swift fox in his land. And you go in the surrounding area, there's a couple here and there, but not very many. The one species I don't have a picture of on here is mountain plovers. Mountain plovers love almost bare dirt for their nesting habitat. So in Montana, Colorado, New Mexico even, you'll find mountain plovers mostly in northern Colorado and then in Montana. Those are their primary habitats. in prairie dog colonies. So again, very highly associated. But these little guys are the ones that are tied directly. You know, it's like I said, a mathematical formula almost. Great question.
Thank you.
Yes, ma'am.
Why do people hate prairie dogs so much?
Hmm.
What do they do?
Why do people hate prairie dogs?
Yeah,
You're
I'm
not
from
from the
the,
West,
I'm
are
from
you?
the Central Carolina.
All those three-legged cows you see out west out there from those broken legs?
Well, I mean, is that it? They're just worried about that?
Well,
or-
there's several reasons. There's myths like that. For a lot of these folks, throughout most of the 20th century, the government was coming out to the poison prairie dogs for them. This was part of your American civic duty to poison prairie dogs. They brought trainloads of strychnine out there to poison prairie dogs for you. U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, back then they're called the Bureau of Biological Services, I believe, or something like that. Agents, federal workers out there poisoning prairie dogs.
What was the reason?
Because in 1901, a guy by the name of, I think it was Vernon Bailey, one of the naturalists, wrote in a U.S. report that one prairie dog consumed as many pounds of grass as X number of cows and all that, and he just kind of made a figure up that made this huge competitive part of it. So all of a sudden the government said, oh, prairie dogs are eating all that grass we have for cows. Oh, we're in the war. We need beef production. Oh, kill them prairie dogs. You know, so these kinds of things can all work together. And now, just within the past 20 to 30 years, we're saying, well, wait, prairie dogs are good. We want prairie dogs. Well, we're trying to change a mindset that occurred for 70, 80 years out there. All of a sudden, turn on a dime and say, no, we want prairie dogs now. So there's a little bit of that also that plays into this.
Travis will be glad to answer questions. I think he'll stick around for a little bit. One last thing to comment. Travis has started this nonprofit organization, Prairie Wildlife Research, that allows him to do this work and to actually reintroduce ferrets into other places around the country. So at the back of the room, he's got some articles for sale, the profits of which all go to fund his research that he's doing and for reintroduction of ferrets. So with that, Travis, thank you very much. Oh yes, one last thing. On campus tomorrow night at 6:30 p.m. in the large College of Natural Resource Auditorium, there will be the award-winning film that Travis starred in. He will not be shirtless. He won't be in a loincloth. But it's an excellent, excellent documentary, and it's for free. And if you're interested at all, it's 6:30 p.m. tomorrow in the College of Natural Resources. Thanks so much.
The big darters that are pushing 3 feet, those are the females. Males are much smaller. And quite often you see that sexual dwarfism in other species like soft-shell turtles, painted turtles, and water snakes. And the females are simply bigger, and that helps obviously allows them to reproduce at a higher rate. So,
how big do your normal soft shells get?
a great big female is going to punch probably 10 pounds. But you know, there's a lot of areas where the growing season's short, the water's cold, and you're going to see more like 3, 4, 5, 6 pounds.
So spiny soft shells bigger?
Yes, yeah. The smoothest dwarf and more limited with some of the needs in the river system, primarily with regard to oxygen and water quality. So, okay, this one's probably not real nice to handle, so I'm just putting it back. If anybody wants to, feel free. Probably want to wash your hands afterwards. I do have a couple other snakes though that are quite nice to hand around. I'm also going to pass out a real interesting turtle that if you're borderline on a reptile and you want to hold one, this is a really nice guy. He is my little spotted turtle, and he's one of the smallest turtles in the world. He's full grown. I've had him almost 20 years. He's one of the turtles like wood, the landings, and the box. It needs their food on land and underwater. So I'll just pass that through.
20-year-old.
Yep. Okay, I'm going to be passing around a Wisconsin milk snake in just a moment. But I want to remind you that there's 23 geographical variations of this species all the way down into Argentina and Ecuador. And some of the tropical species look very, very coral sound-like. And of course, the biggie is red and yellow, kill a fellow, red and black, venom lack. Problem is the tropical subspecies never paid attention to that. Also, with the coral snakes, you can have the same red and black. So that can mess things up. But that little ditty does work in the United States with Florida and Arizona, for the two species of corals that we have.